So go-no-go tasks usually involve prepotent responses and whether you can inhibit them. So these are about motor responses. There's a high probability of a trial involving a go stimulus, so you're pressing the button a lot, and sometimes there's a no-go stimulus, and you have to inhibit that response. You've just kind of pulled back that prepotent response you really sort of primed to be giving. Now, there's a different kind of go-no-go task, which is the emotional go-no-go task, and that's different. The idea of that is to test whether certain kinds of emotional stimuli can cause you to give an impulsive response. So we could call that the experimental approach, right? We're doing an experiment to see whether there's a kind of general law of how the mind works in terms of, do, say, threatening stimuli make you give a response where you shouldn't. The second kind of research you could be doing with an emotional no-go task could be that you want to have an implicit measure of an individual difference. So you think that maybe some people are more sensitive to certain stimuli in terms of whether it makes them more impulsive, and you want to correlate that individual difference with perhaps some kind of mental health issue. So you could call that a psychometric approach. Either way, we want to see whether emotional stimuli have an effect on whether you're going to give an impulsive response, a commission error. And what I'd like to talk about is whether certain task features are optimal or necessary for this kind of goal, again, which isn't the same goal as a non-emotional no-go task. What you would expect, just based on general theory on threat and impulsivity, is that if you are exposed to a threatening stimulus, you're going to be more impulsive. It's going to make you respond more quickly, and it's going to make you make more commission errors. Yeah, so it's kind of an evolutionary concept that, well, if you're being threatened by something, you need to respond really quickly, and you don't have time to think about it. You need to act. You know, if a tiger's going to attack you, you need to run away very quickly. However, when you translate that situation to the emotional go-no-go task, previous studies haven't really found that. So they've found the commission errors. So you make more commission errors when you're exposed to a threatening stimulus, but they didn't find that your reaction time is faster to go stimuli when you're exposed to the threatening stimulus. So that pattern of results suggests a slightly different interpretation, because you're not getting faster, which is part of the idea that you get more impulsive. So based on previous results, you might think, well, you just get less accurate. Maybe it's more about distraction. However, there's a paper in Consciousness and Cognition that we wrote that was published in 2019 that goes into this kind of issue. So the primary thing that study went into was the effect of task relevance of the emotional stimuli. We also had one study that concerned virtual proximity, but throughout the series of studies, something that's very relevant is that we used 50-50 go-no-go ratios, which is a whole point by itself I'd like to comment on. So there are a few arguments I'd like to make for why you should actually very much use a 50-50 go-no-go ratio if you're doing an emotional go-no-go task. So the first argument is basically that the argument not to use that, to use very high go-no-go ratios, is irrelevant for the emotional case. We don't need a strong motor preparation to be going on. We just need people to be doing the task, generating a go response, withholding it, completely fine. It doesn't have to be extreme. We're not looking at the ability to inhibit a motor response in the sense of maybe a stop signal task. Yeah? The idea of the emotional bias you get from seeing a threatening stimulus would be that even without the sort of kind of extreme situation in which you're clicking the button 90% of the time, click, 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 that's not what we need for emotional bias. Even if you just do the task normally, we should see that the threatening stimulus makes you make commission errors and respond more quickly. Now you could say, well, that's quite challenging, right? Maybe it doesn't. Well, we can test that empirically, whether the effect of the threatening stimulus is strong enough that you would get threat-induced impulsivity even in that sort of relatively calm situation. but it has nothing to do with the validity of what you're finding. Yeah, if you do find something. So, no, the idea you need very high go-no-go ratios might make sense for the non-emotional go-no-go task, might not make any, might be relevant at all for the emotional case. However, furthermore, it's actually actively bad if you don't use a 50-50 distribution. So the least bad effect is that you just have a very small number of trials in one of your conditions, or the no-go condition. So if you look at reaction times, that doesn't matter because you don't have reaction times for that. But for accuracy, it matters. And say doing an EEG study, then it matters as well. But what's far worse is two fatal flaws. So one of which is relevant for the task-relevant version of the task, which turns out to be the best version of the task. So if you say your task is to respond to, say, an angry face and not to respond to a neutral face, that makes the emotional stimulus task relevant, as opposed to you responding to some kind of other stimulus and the faces are just there in the background. But in the task-relevant version of the task, if you want to have a block in which you're responding to the angry face, and then you have a block in which you respond to the neutral face, which is the only way you can get your emotional manipulation in, the block context is completely different. So in the block in which you're responding to the go phase, and you've also said, I need to have a lot of go trials, then most of the trials in that block are going to be the angry phase, or the first stimulus in general. And if you're in the block where you said, well, the go stimulus is the neutral phase, or the control stimulus in general, then most of those trials and most of the stimuli you're exposed to in that block will be the neutral type. So there's a huge confound between the trial factor, which is it an angry phase or neutral phase, and the block context, which is, well, what kind of almost mood might you be inducing by these radically different block types. So basically that study is kind of screwed up to an extent, because you try to follow that sort of fake rule of, no, you have to have 90% go trials, 80% go trials. So that's one reason not to do it. The other reason, the similar kind of reasons, is that you're confounding the go-no-go manipulation with frequency, right? So obviously, right, this is what you're saying. I want to have more go-no-go trials and no-go trials. All right. That means you also have different expectations of receiving that, or perceive it, that kind of stimulus. There could be some kind of effect on attention. Who knows what you're making happen by changing those frequencies. Now, all that stuff could interact with the stimulus being threatening or non-threatening. So you, at that point, don't know whether you actually look at interaction between threat and go-no-go, or actually as interaction between threat and any of the other things you've confounded with go versus no-go due to having different frequencies. So those are the most important ones, really. Like it just ruins the task. And finally, there's no reason that I'm aware of that it's methodologically optimal to have a higher baseline impulsivity. But you're closer to the ceiling effect potentially, right? If you're really making a load of commission errors, well, it's actually more difficult, right? So potentially find even more errors due to the emotional manipulation. I don't think that's a priori clear at all. So those are all reasons we actually should use 50-50 go-no-go ratios in emotional go-no-go tasks. Maybe it's a different story for non-emotional go-no-go tasks. All right. So when we go to look at task relevance, what does that mean? So this is an example. These are some trial stimuli you might see in the emotional go-no-go tasks we used. You see angry faces or neutral faces from the best stimulus set, and you'll see a little letter floating around somewhere superimposed on that face. Now, with a task-relevant task, which means the emotional stimulus is task-relevant, whether the emotional content of stimulus, you would say in one block, right, your job is to respond to the angry faces and don't respond to neutral faces. And in the next block, you'd say, now your job is to respond to the neutral faces and not to respond to the angry faces. And then we'll see when you do better. So when you faster on go trials and when you make more commission errors. In the task irrelevant version, you'd have to ignore the faces and you'd be responding to whether it's an O or an X. And you could switch which of those two is the go stimulus over blocks, so similarly to the task relevant feature. But now, in that task irrelevant task version, you're actually in a position where you should be ignoring the emotional stimulus. So if you're really good at selective attention, maybe you're really good at focusing on just that letter, you're reducing the chance that the emotional stimulus will have some kind of effect. And that's what we found, not necessarily because of that reason, but the data are very clear. In the 3 studies that used the 50-50 go-no-go ratio, consistently we found that when we had a task-irrelevant version, we found all the effects you expect. If you had a task-irrelevant version, we found nothing. Yeah, so in the first study, we had a between subject design. Some people did the task-relevant task, some people did the task-relevant task. Strong response speeding in the task-relevant version, nothing in the task-relevant version. Study 2, we had another between subject design. We also had the virtual proximity manipulation there. Again, very strong effect. We did a study with within subject changes of, in which people did both versions of the task and randomized order, and we still found that, yes, in the task relevant version, strong effect on the actual time of the go trials effect. We found nothing in the task irrelevant version. Study 4, we added a task with 90-10 go-no-go ratios, so that's kind of what we kind of argued you shouldn't use and that isn't necessary to use, and we found no significance at all. If you look at the set-induced commission errors, you see similar effects. It's always the task-relevant version that shows you what you theoretically expect to see, that's sensitive to this kind of emotional manipulation. Very briefly, we also looked at virtual proximity in one of these tasks. So what that meant is you saw a picture in the background, and sometimes it would pop out at you, so it would be bigger. And for that as well, only in the task-relevant task did we find effective proximity, where that proximity made that threat-induced impulsivity stronger. So we found that for reaction time, and we found this a very complex theory interaction on accuracy. But I think the main thing for now is that we only found effects of proximity interacting with threat when threat was relevant. So in conclusion, point 1, really I'd say don't use these high go-no-go ratios if you want an emotional go-no-go task. Definitely don't demand it if you're a reviewer, because you're demanding something that's, well, given the arguments presented here, is actually very bad for an emotional go-no-go task. So yeah, use 50-50, although be aware that you might have to cite our conscious recognition paper if the reviewer starts acting up. Second point, use task-relevant tasks. If you want to detect an effective threat on impulsivity, very clearly this is the way you find these effects. It's been replicated now 3 times, and hopefully some other people replicate it independently. But yeah, why would you do a task where there's no effect of threat if that's what you're interested in? You could say, well, is it therefore still automatic? Because if something is really automatic, it should basically always happen. It should happen in the task relevant version. Well, that's, I think, a bit too simplistic. That might depend on your sort of model of what automatic processes are. I'd suggest you need a kind of flexible, reality-based model, sort of based on neuroscience, such as the R3 model, but surely there are other ones as well. And if you define automaticity, I think in a reasonable way, nothing forces you to use less effective tasks. And finally, virtual proximity, that's quite an interesting little effect. Maybe this is a way of simulating defensive cascades, where as the threat comes close to you, that evokes different defensive responses. But again, it only works if you use the task relevant task design.